Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Vales. Today, we are going to talk about the Vanishing Violinist, a mysterious case where music, shadows, and secrets intertwine. A gifted violinist takes the stage, but when the final note fades, she is gone without a trace. Was it an elaborate trick or something far more sinister? Stay with us as we uncover the clues and follow Hercule Poirot into one of his most haunting investigations. Chapter 1. The Disappearance at Brussels. The city of Brussels glittered beneath a crisp autumn sky, its cobbled streets washed in the amber glow of street lamps, the air tinged with the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from the vendors who lined the boulevards, and carriages rolled alongside motor cars in a curious mingling of the old and new, all converging upon one place, the Theatre Royal de la Monnaie. For tonight was no ordinary evening. It was the night Adrien Valcourt, the most celebrated violinist of the age, was to perform before a sold-out house, an event that had attracted dignitaries, aristocrats, critics, musicians, and socialites alike. For Valcourt was not merely a performer, he was a phenomenon. A man whose bow could coax tears from the hardest eyes and whose interpretations were said to transport listeners to another world. And tonight, rumor whispered, he would unveil something extraordinary, a newly discovered composition, perhaps, even a lost relic of a master long dead, though no one seemed entirely sure from whence this rumor had come. But its allure was enough to ignite the city with anticipation. Hercule Poirot, ever punctual, ever immaculate, arrived at the theater with his usual precision, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his mustaches curled into the perfect symmetry that he considered one of the great triumphs of human order. And though music, as he often admitted, was not his first passion, he appreciated it as he appreciated all things, when it was executed with perfection, when discipline and symmetry were present, when the artistry was as precise as the ticking of a fine watch. And for that reason alone he had consented to attend this performance, though Inspector Giroux, his long-standing rival and occasional ally, had also urged him, saying with a trace of irony that even Poirot could not turn his little gray cells upon an empty stomach, and perhaps the concert would provide digestion as well as entertainment. Poirot's eyes swept across the glittering lobby as he entered, noting everything. For to Poirot nothing was ever mere decoration. The clusters of jewel-laden women whispering behind feathered fans, the gentlemen with their polished shoes and immaculate gloves, the faintly anxious air of the theater manager who greeted guests with the obsequiousness of a man fearing disaster, the stern rows of critics already poised to sharpen their pens, and above all, the atmosphere, taut as a violin string, alive with an almost fevered anticipation. When Poirot took his seat in his private box, angled perfectly for both observation of the stage and of the audience, he allowed himself a small smile, for he saw not merely an audience, but a collection of human dramas waiting to unfold. Each gesture, each whisper, each glance between patrons holding the potential of revelation. The orchestra filed in, the conductor bowed, the audience hushed, the lights dimmed, and a ripple of silence fell, the kind of silence that hums with expectation, as if the very walls of the grand theater leaned forward to listen. The chair for the soloist was placed. The Stradivarius of Valcourt rested in its case at the edge of the stage, gleaming faintly under the golden light. Yet when the moment arrived for Adrien Valcourt himself to step forward, no figure appeared from the wings. A pause at first seemed trivial, the kind of hesitation one might expect from a performer who sought to heighten suspense. But the pause lengthened, the silence thickened, and unease stirred like a draft in a closed room, whispers flitting like moths from row to row, until the conductor, frowning, gestured discreetly to an assistant who disappeared behind the curtains. Poirot leaned forward, his keen eyes narrowing, for he had already observed one or two peculiarities earlier that evening. The faint agitation of Valcourt's personal valet in the foyer, the anxious scanning of the crowd by a dark-haired woman. Seated alone in the balcony, the nervous glances exchanged between two men in the second row whose attire was fine, but whose expressions betrayed something other than mere anticipation of art. When at last the manager himself appeared on stage, pale and sweating beneath his formal collar, and announced with strained composure that Monsieur Valcourt was momentarily indisposed and the performance would be delayed, a murmur of unease spread through the hall, and Poirot felt the unmistakable stirring of his instincts for Adrian Valcourt. Perfectionist and consummate professional, was not a man to betray an audience, and indisposition seemed a feeble excuse in the face of such anticipation. The audience rustled, some with indignation, some with concern, some with the selfish irritation of those denied spectacle. Yet to Poirot, it was the pattern of reaction that intrigued him most, for in the tapestry of human behavior, he read clues as one might read a musical score. When the delay stretched beyond what civility could bear, the performance was abandoned, the curtain lowered, and the patrons dispersed with restless murmurs. But in the wings of the theater, chaos was already unfolding. By the time Poirot reached the marble foyer, adjusting his gloves with characteristic fastidiousness, he was met by Inspector Giroux, his expression grave, his usual arrogance tempered by the weight of something more troubling than a mere delay. "He is gone, Poirot," Giroux murmured, drawing close, his voice low yet edged with disbelief. "Adrian Valcourt has vanished. He arrived at the theater an hour before, entered his dressing room. His violin was placed upon the stage in readiness, his costume laid out, his valet dismissed as usual. But when the time came, he was gone. The room is untouched. No sign of struggle, no note, nothing. The greatest violinist in Europe has disappeared as though into the air." Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden light, his fingertips tapping the polished head of his cane as he considered the words, and after a moment he replied softly, almost to himself, "Non, mon ami, a man does not vanish into the air, not even one whose bow can charm the heavens. There is always a reason, always a pattern, always the small detail that betrays the hand of human design. Come, let us see, for the little gray cells already are most intrigued, and I suspect that tonight Adrian Valcourt has played a final note, silent but profound, upon the strings of mystery." Chapter 2. The Dressing Room Clues. The backstage of the Theatre Royal de la Monnaie was a world apart from the grandeur of the auditorium, a labyrinth of narrow corridors, dimly lit staircases, and dressing rooms whose doors bore the names of their temporary occupants. And it was here that Hercule Poirot, with Inspector Giroux at his side, made his way with unhurried yet purposeful steps, the polished tip of his cane tapping softly upon the worn wooden floor, his sharp eyes already darting with bird-like precision to every detail, as though each shadow, each scuff, each trace of human passage were a note in a symphony he alone could hear. And as they approached the dressing room of Adrian Valcourt, they found the valet, a pale and flustered man named Maurice, wringing his hands and stammering to the theater manager, who tried in vain to quiet him. Yet Maurice's agitation betrayed something more than mere shock, for his voice trembled with fear as he insisted he had done everything as always, that Monsieur Valcourt had dismissed him an hour before the concert to have solitude, that he had laid out the immaculate black evening suit, the freshly pressed white shirt, the bow tie, the polished shoes, and that he had insured the violinists. Stradivarius was safely conveyed to the stage, and then, having fulfilled his duties, he had gone to smoke a cigarette by the stage door as he had done countless times before. But when the time came and the knock was given at the dressing-room door to summon the maestro, no voice answered, no footsteps stirred, and when the door was opened with the spare key, the room had been empty, entirely untouched, as though the man had vanished into the very air. Poirot entered the dressing room slowly, his head tilted, his mustaches twitching slightly as he took in the space. For to Poirot, no room was ever merely a room. It was a stage upon which human behavior left its subtle imprint, and already he noted the meticulous order of the place, the suit laid out with precision upon the chair, the shoes polished and placed neatly side by side, the white shirt gleaming under the gaslight, a silver watch lying atop the dressing table beside a pair of cufflinks shaped like tiny violins, a crystal glass of water filled to half, untouched, and on the small writing desk in the corner, a leather-bound notebook closed, a fountain pen resting across it as though left there in haste or in contemplation. Giroux, impatient as ever, muttered that there was nothing to see, that the man must have slipped away by some passage, perhaps to meet a lover, perhaps to evade a debt, perhaps to stage a foolish publicity stunt. But Poirot silenced him with a small wave of the hand and knelt delicately beside the shoes, observing a faint trace of moisture on the soles, though the streets outside had been dry for days. And then he lifted his gaze to the carpet, where, near the door, there was the faintest impression, not of a man's shoe, but of something narrower, elongated, as though a heel had pressed briefly before vanishing into the pattern, a mark nearly invisible to the casual eye, yet to Poirot it was as eloquent as a signature. He rose and moved to the dressing table, where his gaze lingered upon the glass of water, untouched, and he remarked softly, "A man who prepares to perform. He drinks, he calms the throat, he moistens the lips, yet this water remains as full as when it was poured. Why? Because he was interrupted, taken perhaps, before the act of performance, before the final rituals of preparation." He turned next to the notebook, his gloved fingers brushing across its cover before opening it, and within he found pages filled with a meticulous hand, notations of rehearsals, lists of performances, small sketches of musical phrases, and then, near the back, a curious note written in hurried strokes. To play is to remember. To play is to risk. Poirot repeated the words softly, his brow furrowing, for the phrase was enigmatic, suggestive of something deeper than mere artistry, perhaps a hidden burden, perhaps a secret that Valcourt carried within his music. Giroux scoffed that artists often scribbled nonsense, but Poirot merely smiled, for he had already filed the clue away within his orderly mind. His gaze shifted again, this time to the mirror above the dressing table, where upon the lower right corner a faint smudge lingered, not the careless fingerprint of a valet, for Maurice was far too meticulous, but rather a blurred trace as though someone had pressed something small, metallic perhaps, against the surface in haste, leaving behind a whisper of its presence, and Poirot, leaning closer, murmured, "It is often the smallest things, mon ami, that shout the loudest." Maurice, the valet, was called into the room once more, and under Poirot's quiet yet relentless questioning he admitted that Monsieur Valcourt had been in an odd mood for days, that he had spoken little, had eaten little, and once, only once, had muttered to himself about the letter, though Maurice had not dared to inquire further, for Valcourt was a man of temperament, brilliant yet mercurial, who kept his secrets close. Poirot, ever attuned to nuance, noted the flicker in Morris's eyes as he spoke, the hesitation before the mention of the letter, and he filed it away with the same precision he gave to the layout of his mustaches each morning. He then asked to be shown the stage itself, for if Valcourt had prepared to perform, his instrument must hold part of the answer. And so they crossed the narrow corridors until they reached the grand space behind the velvet curtain where the Stradivarius rested in its case upon a chair, gleaming faintly as though mocking the absence of its master. Poirot examined it carefully, noting that it had been placed with unusual haste, the bow askew, the lining of the case slightly disturbed, as though in the act of preparing it someone had been interrupted or had little care for the reverence with which Valcourt always handled his instrument. And then his eyes found something else, a faint dark hair, no longer than an inch, caught against the velvet lining. Not of the violinist, whose hair was chestnut, but black, sleek, unmistakably feminine, and Poirot plucked it delicately with a gloved hand, holding it aloft with the air of a man who had just uncovered a thread that might unravel a tapestry. "You see, Giroux," Poirot said softly, "a man may vanish, but he leaves behind the shadow of his presence, and sometimes the shadow of another as well." The inspector frowned, unimpressed, but Poirot was already lost in thought, piecing together the silent clues, the water untouched, the shoes damp against dry streets, the mysterious note, the smudge upon the mirror, the black hair within the violin case. And in his mind, the outline of a mystery began to take shape, not yet clear, but tantalizing, like the opening notes of a melody whose full theme had yet to be revealed. He knew this was no mere disappearance, no lover's tryst, no publicity stunt, for Adrian Valcourt had not simply walked away. He had been drawn into something deeper, darker, and infinitely more dangerous, and the theater, with its shadows and whispers, had become not merely the stage for a performance, but the stage for a crime, a performance whose conductor remained unseen, whose finale was yet to come. And as Poirot stood amidst the silence of the abandoned stage, the applause that never came echoing in the void, he knew that the vanishing of the violinist was but the first note in a symphony of deception, one that he, Hercule Poirot, must conduct to its final, inevitable crescendo. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Violet Balcony. The next morning broke gray over Brussels, the streets damp with a thin mist that clung to the stone facades of the old city, and Hercule Poirot, rising early in his immaculate apartment on the Rue de Martyrs, had already ordered his customary breakfast of chocolate and brioche. Consumed with precise enjoyment before setting out once more to the theater, for though Giroux had declared the investigation futile, muttering of debts, elopements, and dramatic egotism, Poirot was not so easily deceived by appearances, and the little gray cells demanded order where chaos presented itself, symmetry where there seemed only confusion, and as he walked briskly through the fog-veiled boulevards with his cane tapping lightly in rhythm, his mind replayed the details of the night before. The shoes damp though the streets were dry, the untouched glass of water, the cryptic note, the smudge upon the mirror, the black hair within the violin case, each detail small, but together forming the edges of a picture yet unseen. When he arrived once more at the Theatre Royal de la Monnaie, the stage was silent, its velvet curtains heavy and lifeless, but he was met by the theater manager, pale with fatigue and worry, who confessed that rumors already abounded in the city. Some whispered that Valcourt had been abducted by creditors, others that he had fled with a secret lover, still others that his disappearance was an elaborate publicity scheme, and yet none could explain the simple fact that the man's violin had been left behind. For no artist so devoted to his craft would abandon the very soul of his art. Poirot listened patiently, nodded, and then asked to be shown the list of attendees, for while Giroux had confined his suspicions to the stage and its immediate environs, Poirot believed that the true answer might lie within the audience, for crime, like performance, required both actor and witness. The manager hesitated, but Poirot's insistence brooked no refusal, and soon he held in his hands a neat ledger of names and seats, and as he studied it, one entry drew his eye: a ticket for the balcony, row 3, seat 7, purchased under no name but held for Mademoiselle. And when Poirot inquired further, the usher who had overseen that section recalled clearly the woman who had occupied it, a striking figure in a violet gown with matching gloves, dark hair pinned beneath a hat adorned with a single feather, a woman who had sat alone, scanning the crowd nervously until the moment the lights dimmed, after which she seemed to vanish, For when the performance was cancelled and the audience dispersed, her seat was found empty, though no one recalled her leaving. Poirot's mustaches twitched as he considered this, and already the black hair discovered within the violin case whispered of connection. With characteristic determination, he set about finding her, and it was not long before discreet inquiries at the grand hotels of the city led him to her name. Mademoiselle Celeste Arnaud, a Frenchwoman, registered at the Hotel Metropole under circumstances that suggested both wealth and secrecy, for she had paid in cash and received no visitors. Poirot, dressing himself with even greater precision than usual, presented himself at the hotel that afternoon, and through charm, insistence, and the unshakable weight of his reputation, he secured a private interview. She received him in a sitting room whose curtains were half drawn against the weak daylight, her violet gown exchanged for a simple black dress, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with weariness yet alight with something sharper, fear or guilt or both. And when Poirot introduced himself, she gave a faint, sad smile as though she had expected him all along. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, her French accent lilting but tinged with tremor, "you come because of Adrien." Poirot inclined his head, his voice gentle yet piercing. "Just so, mademoiselle. He has vanished. And you were there, in the balcony, watching, waiting. What?" She hesitated, wrung her hands, then at last whispered, "Because I feared this would happen. Because I knew he was in danger." At this, Poirot leaned forward, his eyes sharp as blades though. His manner was mild. "Danger, you say? From whom?" But she shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes, and replied, "There are things I cannot speak, not yet." Adrien carried a secret, one bound up with his music, one that others desired, desperately. I begged him to tell someone, to let me help him, but he would not. He said only that if anything befell him, his violin would tell the truth. Poirot's gaze sharpened, recalling the disarranged case, the stray hair, the note within the notebook, and he asked quietly, "Mademoiselle, what is your relation to him?" She lowered her head, her voice breaking. "Once, long ago, we were lovers. But more than that, we were bound by something larger. Adrien discovered something in Italy, in a monastery, a composition hidden for centuries, but also—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her lips, her whole frame trembling. Poirot, with the delicacy of a surgeon, placed a hand lightly upon the armrest of her chair and said gently, "Ma chère, if you do not speak, others may die. Already your silence has borne a weight. Let us share it, you and I." But she only wept, murmuring, "I cannot, not yet. If I speak, they will know. They are watching even now." Poirot studied her keenly, noting every flicker of her expression, every hesitation, and though she would say no more, he understood enough that Adrien's disappearance was tied not to vanity, nor to romance, but to something he had uncovered, something within his music, something others coveted enough to risk abduction or worse. When he left her hotel, stepping once more into the mist-veiled streets, his mind raced, and though Giroux mocked him for chasing shadows of women and whispers of music, Poirot was certain now that the case was no simple matter, but a conspiracy, whose threads reached far beyond the theater. The violet woman in the balcony had confirmed what the little gray cells already suspected, that Adrien Valcourt had not vanished by chance, but had been silenced by design, and somewhere within the silent strings of his Stradivarius, within the notes he had not yet played, lay the key to why. Chapter 4. The Secret Composition. The day after his meeting with Mademoiselle Celeste Arnaud dawned bleak, a thin drizzle tracing lines down the windows of Brussels, as though the city itself mourned the silence where music should have been. And Hercule Poirot, seated neatly at his writing desk, contemplated the puzzle with the calm intensity of a chess player before the decisive move, his fingers steepled, his mustaches bristling slightly, as he reviewed the clues already assembled. Adrian Valcourt, a man of precision, vanished without trace from a locked dressing room. The damp soles of his shoes in contradiction to the dry streets, the untouched glass of water suggesting interruption, the cryptic note declaring, "To play is to remember. To play is to risk." The smudge upon the mirror, the stray black hair. In the violin case, and now, the words of Celeste, hinting at a secret bound not to romance, but to music itself, a composition unearthed from some monastery in Italy, a composition perhaps worth a man's life. Poirot knew the value of secrets, and he also knew that music, for all its beauty, could conceal power, for a melody might contain a cipher, a code, even a confession, and if Valcourt had discovered something buried within the bars of a forgotten score, then the motive for his disappearance might be more dangerous than any crime of passion. Thus it was that Poirot returned once more to the Theatre Royal de la Monnaie, where under his quiet authority he requested access to Valcourt's belongings, and from the depths of a locked trunk he was presented with a folder of sheet music. The pages yellowed, the ink faded, the cover inscribed not with Valcourt's hand, but with an older script in Italian. Reading Lacrima di Dio, the tear of God, Poirot handled the fragile pages delicately, his eyes narrowing as he observed the notation, intricate, complex, almost mathematical in its arrangement, and though he was no musician, his little gray cells detected patterns not of artistry, but of concealment, repetitions, and anomalies that suggested not merely music, but something encoded. It was then that he summoned to his side a trusted acquaintance, a young Belgian pianist named Henriette, known for her precision of sight reading. And under Poirot's watchful gaze she attempted to play the composition upon the theater's piano, yet the melody that emerged was strange, haunting, unlike anything she had encountered, and more than once she faltered, remarking that certain passages seemed deliberately unplayable, chords requiring stretches beyond human capacity, intervals so abrupt they defied the ear, as though the composer had designed not to be performed but to be deciphered. Poirot, his mustaches twitching in satisfaction, murmured, "Just so, mademoiselle. It is not music to be played, it is a message to be read." He compared the unusual markings with Valcourt's notebook, cross-referencing the cryptic phrase, and slowly, with methodical patience, he began to discern a pattern, a code hidden within the structure, one that spelled out fragments of words in Latin: vengeance, treasure, betrayal, words that hinted at an ancient story buried within the manuscript. And yet, more curious still, certain measures contained references to geographical coordinates, not exact but suggestive, pointing toward a monastery in Tuscany, the very place Valcourt had visited before his return to Brussels. Poirot realized then that Valcourt had discovered something explosive, perhaps tied to wealth, perhaps to history, something men would kill for, and that he had intended to reveal it subtly, encoded within his performance, so that to play was indeed to risk. It was at this juncture that Inspector Giroux barged into the rehearsal hall, sneering at Poirot's foolish games with dead men's music, declaring that Valcourt had likely fled to Paris with a mistress. But Poirot, unruffled, replied coolly, "Non, mon ami, you are blinded by the obvious. A man does not abandon his life's work, his beloved Stradivarius, for a tryst. He was taken because he had something that others desired." At that very moment, a stagehand entered with trembling hands, presenting a discovery from behind the theater, a torn scrap of paper caught within a floorboard near Valcourt's dressing room, the edges singed as though it had been hastily burned, and upon it were scrawled two words in French: La Société. Poirot's eyes narrowed, for the name was known to him. A shadowy cabal rumored across Europe, collectors of forbidden manuscripts and relics, men of power who trafficked in secrets as others trafficked in gold. He now saw the pattern emerging. Adrian Valcourt had stumbled into possession of something the Société desired, had encoded it within music to protect it, and for this he had been silenced. Yet the question remained, was he dead, or was he hidden, held somewhere until he yielded what he knew? Poirot's mind raced as he gazed again upon the sheet music, upon the deliberate impossibility of its performance, upon the message that only those with patience and intellect might decipher, and he murmured to himself, Adrian Valcourt, you have left us the truth, but you have paid dearly for it, and now it is for Poirot to see the design complete. As the rain tapped against the tall windows and thunder rolled faintly across the city, Poirot resolved that the next step would be to trace the shadow of La Société within Brussels itself, to find who among the glittering audience had ties to this hidden hand. For within that velvet hall of applause and anticipation had sat not merely admirers of art, but conspirators of theft and silence, and among them, surely, lay the key to the vanishing violinist. Chapter 5. The curtain falls on the case. The grand salon of the Brussels Theatre had been transformed into an arena of revelation. Heavy curtains still framed the stage, but the lights above blazed with a brilliance reserved not for performances, but for confessions. A crowd had gathered, not the elegant audience of music lovers who once filled these seats, but a quieter assembly of police officials, journalists, family members, and curious onlookers, each waiting with bated breath. At the center of it all stood Hercule Poirot, as precise and immaculate as ever, his silhouette casting a sharp line beneath the golden glow. His waxed mustache gleamed faintly, his hands rested gently upon his lapels, and his dark eyes surveyed the room with a gravity that seemed to bend the very air. On a table nearby, laid gently upon a crimson cloth, rested the violin, the instrument that had sparked a city-wide panic, that had been whispered about in hushed tones across cafes and boulevards, now seemed almost ordinary in its silence. But to those gathered, it carried the weight of tragedy, theft, deception, and betrayal. Every breath in the room seemed to linger upon its polished wood. Inspector Delacluse, his brow furrowed, leaned forward. Monsieur Poirot, he murmured, his voice carrying despite the hush of the chamber. I trust you are ready to present your findings? Poirot inclined his head. Mais oui, mon ami. The hour of truth has arrived. You shall see how all the threads, so tangled and confusing, unravel into a single, clear pattern. The story of the vanishing violinist is, in truth, a story of ambition, of jealousy, and of the frailties of the human heart. The inspector nodded gravely, motioning for silence. The last murmur of the gathering faded, leaving only the faint creak of the stage boards and the measured rhythm of Poirot's voice. Poirot began by turning to the anxious figure of Isabella Moretti, her eyes wide, her hands twisting a silk handkerchief until it seemed it might tear in two. Mademoiselle Moretti, he said gently, your devotion to your art is unquestionable. You practiced with a fervor that astonished all who knew you. Yet you were surrounded by those who, how shall we say, did not wish you to shine quite so brightly. Gasps rippled faintly among the listeners. Isabella blinked rapidly, as if fighting tears. Poirot's gaze, however, shifted to the shadows where Lucien Duval, the ambitious rival violinist, stood stiffly with arms crossed. Lucien, Poirot continued, his tone now sharper. Your envy was a poison. You feared that Isabella's performance with this rare violin would eclipse your own career, that her brilliance would secure the patronage and the acclaim you craved. And so you devised a scheme most cruel. You conspired to see her instrument vanish, not through some ghostly hand, not through a locked-room miracle, but through a simple sleight of hand on the night of rehearsal. Duval's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The inspector's eyes narrowed, ready to pounce should Duval utter a word. Poirot, undeterred, gestured to the violin. You see, the trick was simple but effective. The violin was switched with a replica, a forgery made to resemble it closely in the dim light of rehearsal. Isabella played it, unaware. Later, when she prepared for her grand performance, the switch was revealed. Panic, despair, humiliation, it was all part of the plan. At this, a murmur of shock rippled through the gathered crowd. Some clutched their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But Poirot raised a delicate finger. What Duval did not anticipate was the presence of another actor in this play. For jealousy was not his alone. There was Signor Benedetti, the agent, who sought to profit from Isabella's despair. If she could not perform, her career would falter. And who would she turn to? Why, her agent, who could offer her a new path, a lucrative contract elsewhere. The violin was not merely stolen. It was meant to shatter her spirit, to bind her fate to those who would exploit her. Inspector Delacluse let out a sharp breath. Mon Dieu. Poirot's voice softened, almost mournful. But the most tragic twist, Amos, is that this plot was not confined to ambition or profit. It was poisoned with something darker. Love turned sour. Maestro Rinaldi, who adored Isabella as one might adore a muse, discovered the plot too late. In his desperation to protect her, he became entangled in the scheme. When Isabella vanished on that fateful evening, it was not by chance. She had been lured, coaxed into secrecy by words of supposed affection and promises of safety. Instead, she was hidden away, silenced, and betrayed. A collective gasp filled the room. Isabella's eyes widened in horror. No, no, Maestro Rinaldi, she whispered, her voice trembling. Poirot nodded gravely. Yes, mademoiselle. He believed he was saving you from humiliation, from scandal. But his misguided act of protection became one of destruction. And when the violin was found at last, hidden within the theater itself, it told its tale. Not of spirits, not of curses, but of human frailty. Inspector Delacluse stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes burning with the weight of revelation. And this explains the locked doors? The mystery of the vanished instrument. Precisely, Poirot replied, his mustache twitching. The violin was concealed within a false panel backstage, placed there during rehearsal when all eyes were upon Isabella. Later, it was to be smuggled out. But circumstances, police, suspicion, chance prevented it. It remained hidden, its silence louder than any song. The inspector turned sharply toward Duval, Benedetti, and the maestro. You will answer for this, each of you. His voice carried the steel of finality. Poirot, however, raised a hand, halting the movement of officers. Non, mon ami. Justice, yes. But let us remember, the crime here is not of simple theft. It is of hearts corrupted, of ambitions turned monstrous. To punish is easy. To understand, that is the true task. Silence fell again. Even the crackle of lamps above seemed to hush in respect. Poirot's eyes softened as they found Isabella. Once more, Mademoiselle, you must not let this tragedy define you. You are an artist. The violin is but an instrument. The music, it lives within you. Tears finally streamed down her cheeks, but she bowed her head, whispering, Merci, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot inclined his head, then turned back to the assembly. His voice, steady and resonant, carried through the chamber. And so, Mesdames et Messieurs, the case of the vanishing violinist comes to its end. It was not the work of phantoms, nor the hand of fate, but the flaws of men and women, who let envy and fear consume them. Let it serve as a reminder to guard not only the treasures we hold in our hands, but the treasures we hold in our hearts. The crowd stirred, heavy with reflection. The inspector gave the signal, and officers stepped forward at last there, boots echoing against the boards as Duval, Benedetti, and the maestro were led away. Isabella sat in silence, her hand resting gently upon the violin, as though weighing the cost of its return. Poirot, his task complete, adjusted his cuffs, and walked toward the exit. His figure, small yet commanding, disappeared into the shadows of the theater, leaving behind whispers that would echo through Brussels for years to come. And there you have it, the mystery of the vanishing violinist solved by none other than Hercule Poirot, with every thread tied in that unmistakable style only he possesses. If you enjoyed unraveling this case with us, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who love a good mystery, and subscribe to Haunting Veils for more gripping Poirot investigations and timeless tales of intrigue. Until next time, keep your eyes sharp, your mind sharper, and remember, the smallest details can hide the greatest secrets.